Greetings from the Tech Cave, Fenris here, and today I have in front of me a Super Famicom. But this is no ordinary Super Famicom. Oh no, this right here is the coveted one-chip Super Famicom. So for those that don't know, the one chip is a revision of the Super Nintendo / Super Famicom motherboard that is highly sought after by retro gaming enthusiasts due to the fact that it has noticeably sharper video output than previous revisions. Now, granted, it did have a few issues, but there are ways in which we can fix that. So, another thing you may notice though is, unfortunately the shell is in dire straits. So, even though the video output is sharp, the shell itself certainly is not. And unfortunately, it looks like whoever owned this last did do a bit of a retrobrite attempt and it went horribly wrong. So, while the motherboard is still good, the shell obviously is not. So, what are we to do? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take the board from this Super Famicom and we're going to be converting it into a Super Nintendo. Now, you might be thinking, well, how are we going to go about doing that, considering the fact that they are physically different from each other? Well, sit back, relax, and let's begin. So let's start things off by tearing down this system. Okay, so I have fully torn down the Super Famicom, and as you can see here, this is all the parts that we're going to be needing from the Super Famicom in order to convert it into a Super Nintendo. Now, there are some other parts that we're going to need from the Super Nintendo side, but we'll get to that in a moment. Now, internally speaking, like the hardware itself, there is a couple of parts that we're going to need to swap out in order to convert it into a Super Nintendo. And I have those parts right here. Now, the rest of these parts are just for doing some extra mods to this system, but the two important parts in this little baggie here are this Super Nintendo backplate, because it has a completely different connector that the Super Nintendo uses, and as well as a Super Nintendo RF port. You can tell that it is a Super Nintendo RF port if it starts with SNS. Now, granted, we don't necessarily need this if you're not going to be using RF. I'm just doing this for completion's sake. So, with that out of the way, we're going to remove the shielding here. And this is a system that I've already recapped, so we don't have to worry about that. We will be swapping out the regulator with a 78SO5, and we are going to be doing some mods to this Super Famicom in order to fix some of the known issues with the one chip. So, let's get to it. Okay, so we're nice and zoomed in here on the under section of the Super Famicom board, and the reason why is we're going to be performing the brightness fix. So to quickly explain, one major issue with the Super Famicom / Super Nintendo one-chip boards is even though that they have sharper video output, they also have much brighter video output, meaning that colors are not only washed out, but finer details tend to go missing due to the brighter output. Now, brightness can be compensated using, your display's internal OSD. You can also adjust it on the scaler, or you can even use the HD Retrovision cables, but really, it should be fixed in the console itself. So, the way that we're going to fix it is, we're going to be removing R6, R7, and R8. These are 160 ohm pull-down resistors. Now, previous revisions of the Super Nintendo, or Super Famicom, used 130 ohm pull-down resistors on the RGB lines, so these values are incorrect. Now, there have been other brightness fix issues in the past where you would, I think, put in like 750 ohm resistors and they work in conjunction with these 3 resistors. But when you combine resistance between the two, you get a total resistance load of 130 ohms anyways, so it's just better to replace these with the correct value. Now, you could also do, and this would probably result in the best possible video output, an RGB bypass. But the reason why I'm doing it like this instead is because when you replace these 3 pull down resistors with 130 ohm resistors, it should not only improve RGB video output, but it should also improve composite and S video. So without further delays, we're just going to flux these up and remove the resistors. So now that we got the brightness resistors installed, we can now turn our attention to the other problem with one-chip systems, and that is ghosting. So under certain shades of color, you may notice what appear to be faint repeating graphical detail, and this is a phenomenon called ghosting, and it seems to be caused by C11 here. Now, I'm not sure why, but this component in particular seems to have aged rather poorly. So to fix this, what we're going to be doing is replacing C11 with this. This is a 470 nanofarad, 35 volt X7R ceramic capacitor. Now, you want to use 0805 for these Model 1 chips and 0603 for the Model 2. I personally like to use 0603 across the board simply because it would fit all cases. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove C11 and replace it with this little jewel right here. So let's get going. So now that we got the one-chip exclusive issues out of the way, we can now turn our attention to this area here, because we're going to be removing and replacing the 7805 with the 78S05. As well, we're going to be removing C61 and replacing it with a 22 microfarad 10 volt X5R ceramic capacitor for the vertical bar fix. And we're going to be removing and replacing the back panel and RF port with ones that I salvaged from a Super Nintendo. So, without further delay, let's get to it. Okay, so I did some touch-ups off camera, but as you saw, I was able to install the replacement back panel, the RF port, as well as the 78SO5 and the new C61 capacitor, which is there to rectify the vertical bar issue. So all that's really left to do is install this, the 470 microfarad capacitor that normally comes with the cap kit. So we're just going to simply bend these over, fold them again, try to space them out to where they'll go over both legs cleanly. Trim. Looks a little rough. Let me see if I can space that out a little more. That's better. Actually, let me also trim these legs here so that they're not stabbing at the capacitor. Polyflex. Tack one leg down. And get the other. Negative, negative, positive, positive. And there we go. We now have the 470 microfarad capacitor done. And with that, all the solder work is done on this board. Objection! Alright, so while I was in the middle of filming, it was brought to my attention by Voltar that you really should not be adding this capacitor onto the voltage regulator. And the reason why is, when you add this capacitor on and you power off the system, there is a chance that this capacitor will dump the excess load back onto the VCC rail, meaning there is a chance that you can cause a voltage spike and it will pop one of the more critical chips on the system. So ideally you don't want to have this capacitor installed, but in the event that you do, you can install a 1N4001 or 1N4148 diode along the input and output side of the regulator. You put the stripe side on the input side and the non-stripe side on the output side, as you see here. Now, in future videos, I will not be adding this 470 microfarad capacitor on the regulator, and I may revisit some of my old Super Nintendo or Super Famicom restoration videos with this new information in mind. So with that out of the way, let's get back to the rest of the video. So now the rest of it is all on the shell. Okay, this is something I wanted to bring up real quickly, but I didn't even catch this at first, but this board revision is a one chip 03. And the reason why that's important is the one chip 03 is the only one chip revision outside of the Model 2 that does not have C-Sync natively installed. Now, the reason why we didn't do the C-Sync install is because it seems that previously the C-Sync mod was already done, because normally this transistor would be missing, a few resistors would be missing, and a couple of capacitors here would be missing. So it looks like some of the work was already done for us, so that's good at least. But something to keep in mind, if you're working with a one chip 03, I would suggest getting the C-Sync restoration kit from Console 5 and install that to your board. So without further delay, let's move on to the shell part. Okay, so in terms of the Super Nintendo side of things, there are a few official first-party parts that we are going to need to get our hands on in order for this conversion to work. So first order of business is the Super Nintendo cartridge throat, the Super Nintendo eject lever, the reset slider, should have the other one. Ah, here it is. The power slider, the actual sliding pieces for both of those buttons, and last but certainly not least, the controller port. Now, I'm pretty sure that there is a replacement controller port board being worked on, but as far as I can tell, there are no replacement controller boards, like the whole unit, that you can find online, so you do have to source an original one. And I believe the third-party shells for Super Nintendo that you can find on AliExpress do have this piece as well as these lever pieces. But we are not going to be using that shell today. Instead, we're going to be using this majestic shell. Oh, let me just get the rest of these parts out of the way. This majestic shell from Retro Game Restore. Now, as you can see, I went for the atomic purple, and as well, I purchased the extra parts to go with it. This is the controller port piece and the cartridge flap. But even with these parts, you still need to source other pieces from an actual Super Nintendo. So it's best to source these from either a completely dead unit, or maybe you might find a good deal on just these parts alone. So without further delay, let's get the Super Nintendo put together. Okay, so let's start with the controller port. And I did mention earlier that we were done with the soldering. Well, I kind of lied. So we are going to be doing one extra mod. We're going to be replacing the LED and resistor with a brand new LED and resistor. This is a slow fade RGB LED. And in order for this to work, we have to replace the resistor here, which is 160 ohms, with this 100 ohm resistor. So let's get this controller port taken apart. So the way that we're going to do that is pretty simple. We just feed the ribbon through like so, pull the cable out, and undo these clips. There we go. Now, if all you wanted to do was replace the front port with this one right here, then all you would have to do is just put this back on, clip this on, and then you're good to go. But since we're going to be doing the LED mod, we need to desolder the controller ports as well as the LED and the resistors. So that's just these solder points here. So let me fire up the desoldering station and let's get to it. Okay, so now that we got everything removed, let's talk about reinstalling the new LED. Now, as you can see here, it clearly marks as to the orientation in which you position your LED. Now, you will also notice the footprint is keyed. However, the key is actually going to be different due to the fact that the LED has this flat side on the opposite side of this LED. So we're just going to pay attention to this top diagram here. Now, according to this, the anode goes on the left and the cathode goes on the right. So to figure out which is which, anode is the longer leg of the LED and cathode is the shorter leg of the LED. So, in other words, the way that we're going to put this in is simply we're going to take this LED and plop it in like so. Now the flat side will obviously be on the opposite side of where the flat side is on the silk screen, but like I said, it's just due to the fact that we're using a different LED. So we're just going to pop in the resistor as well and solder this all together. Okay, so now that we got the new LED installed, the 100 ohm resistor, as well as the controller ports all soldered into the board, we can now move on to reassembling the controller board. So what we're gonna do is put in our diffuser, take our replacement controller port cover, slot it in like so. And now we just feed our ribbon like so. Actually, it has to go in like this. If you ever wonder like how you put this together, the contact side should always match the contact pins here. So just make sure it's metal on metal. Loop this through. And there we go. We got our controller port all assembled. So let's move on to the rest of the shell. All right, so let's start from the bottom and work our way to the top. Okay, so we have the bottom shell nearly reassembled, and all we need to install now is the eject lever. So before we proceed on, there is something that I did notice. You will need the original Super Nintendo eject lever spring, and the reason why is because the Super Famicom ones are not measured out the same. So these ones are equal distance for both ends of the lever. This one, however, it's shorter for the lever side and longer for the post side. If you don't have the original, you're not going to be able to lock the eject lever in place. So that's just something to keep in mind. You will need the eject lever piece from an original Super Nintendo. So we're just going to come in. Trying to get this on camera. Just twist a little bit to slide in. And there we go. All set. So let's focus on the top shell. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to this. This is the Super Nintendo cartridge throw, and it is by far the most critical piece of the Super Nintendo, because not only does it hold the spring and cartridge flap, but it's also necessary for the reset slider, because the way that this resets is unlike the Super Famicom, which uses a push button. The Super Nintendo uses a reset sliding button, so when it slides up, it hits this little plunger piece here. So not only will you need this piece, but you'll also need its accompanying hardware, that being 7 screws and the little spring for the reset slider. Now, before we install this into our Super Nintendo, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the 2 security tabs here that prevents the system from playing Super Famicom games. Now, I am aware that there is a 3D printed piece that has these tabs already removed, and I might look at that in a future video, but number one, I don't have that on me at this moment, and number two, even if I did, we would still need this piece because we need to salvage this plunger, because unlike the actual Super Nintendo cartridge throat, there's no 3D printed alternative for this plunger. So, with that out of the way, we're going to turn our attention to these tabs, and what we're going to do is we're just going to simply cut them out with this pair of snips. And in addition, I'm going to come in with a craft knife in order to kind of clean it up. So, let's get to it. Okay, so I had to stop filming after using these snips to cut the majority of the tabs out, mainly because when it comes to working with blades like X-Acto knives, I like to make sure that I am 1000% focused and concentrated on the areas that I'm working on, mainly because I want to make sure that I don't slip with the knife or end up breaking the knife while I'm carving or cutting or whatever. So it's always best to practice good safety, and it's not worth potentially injuring yourself or ruining the mod just for a bit of film. Now, as you can see, I did manage to carve out the rest of the chunks, and I even went over it with a flat file just to kind of smooth things out. So with that, this piece is ready to go, so let's get the rest of our Super Nintendo put together. Okay, so there's only one more thing we need to do before we reassemble everything, and that's preparing the cartridge flap. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the little spring here that's for the flap, and in order to put this in correctly, we need to make sure this short bent piece is making contact with the back portion of the cartridge flap, like so. And this piece is going to be folding over onto this little channel right here. So it should look like so. Now you will see that it bends up, but that's okay. Once we put the cartridge throat on, it should lock this in place. So let's get to reassembling this Super Nintendo, shall we? Okay, so while I was in the middle of reassembling the Super Nintendo, I seem to have hit a bit of a snag. So this piece right here, which is the Super Nintendo power slider, seems to be just slightly too large for the hole here, because that is a really tight fit. And the thing is though, it's not an issue with like the reset part, because that slides up and down just fine. So I think what it is that this piece is just slightly too wide on the sides. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a sanding block, and I'm just going to ever so slightly sand down these sides right here, so that way it will properly fit with the case. So let me just move this aside and get this sanded down. Okay, so I think I got it down. So now this piece goes in much easier, and it slides up and down. There's still a little resistance, but definitely not bad enough to where it's like super tight. So since we got that dialed down, let's finish reassembly. Okay, now that we got the Super Nintendo fully reassembled, there's just one little extra detail that I want to take care of, and that is, we're going to put some stickers on it. Now, this bag right here contains stickers that I got from Hoskinson Industries. Now, I'll leave a link to their site in the description below, but basically they make some really excellent reproduction stickers for game consoles. And they do it for the Super Nintendo, the original Nintendo, the Nintendo 64, and even the Sega Genesis. So these are great for these shell replacements. And as well, I got here a couple of badges from an eBay seller in Poland. Now, unfortunately, it seems that at the time of filming, they aren't making these anymore. So I'm not really sure as to where you can get an alternative, but for the time being, these badges, you may see them pop up again on eBay, you may not, who knows. So with that out of the way, let's get this system dressed up. Okay, first order of business are these badges here. And the way that we're going to prep these is very similar to like vinyl stickers. So what we need to do is take a plastic card here and just run it over onto the top sections of these stickers. That way they adhere to the transfer layer of the sticker sheets. So when we peel off the paper back, we can then transfer it to the Super Nintendo with very little issue. So we're just gonna take the card here, go over it a couple times. I like to do 5, but you can also do 7 for good luck. And then we're just going to do the same to the Nintendo logo. And that should be good to go. And just to make sure, we're going to take one end here and just slowly peel back. Actually, we'll just do it from the transfer side, and it should stick. Yep, see? It sticks to the transfer paper. So we're just gonna flatten that out, and I'm gonna bring in the Super Nintendo in frame, and we're just gonna stick these on. Alright, sorry about that little jump cut there. I was struggling a bit to get the Nintendo logo on. It seemed that the logo just did not want to adhere to the transfer paper, but as you can see, I was able to get it on eventually. Now, with that out of the way, and this looking really nice so far, let's apply the rest of the stickers. Okay, so we have the Super Nintendo all hooked up and ready for our final testing. So I have the RGB SCART cable currently plugged in, so let's pop in the burn-in test cart and fire it up to see if it works. Let me try reseating that. There we go. Sometimes it just requires a bit of reseating to get it to work. Alright, let's see. Work RAM, pass, everything's passing. APU, pass. All right, passed all the tests, so let's flick off the power. Actually, before we move on to the other games, let's unplug this, switch to composite. Let's make sure all of our video formats work. Plug that in. Works over composite. Sorry, I keep wanting to press the lever. Get the cable out of the way. Switch to S video. Works over S video. So now we're just going to switch back to RGB. Pop out the game for real this time. And we're gonna pop in some Super Mario Kart. American version this time. Okay, so mode 7 seems to be working just fine. Now let's make sure the CIC is good with some Donkey Kong Country. Looks like it's passing the CIC checks. Let's just get into the game, see if that plays. And that looks like Donkey Kong Country to me. Alright, now for expansion pin games with Star Fox 2. Expansion pin games seem to be working. And last but certainly not least, we can't forget our good old Kamen Rider. And looks like we got Kamen Rider. Alright, and with that, the ultimate Super Nintendo 1 chip is complete. Now, there was some hiccups along the way, but you know what? I'd say this system turned out wonderfully. So, this is not going to be the last time I visit the Super Nintendo. There are other videos that I have planned for this system, but for now, this is a really sexy piece of kit. And one of the videos, though, I will mention is I do plan on also building an ultimate Super Famicom, and that one's going to be based on the 3-chip revision, but I'm just waiting on one extra component to really make that the ultimate 3-chip Super Famicom. But in the meantime, thank you all so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, until the blue moon rises, I'll see you next time.